Scoring and slipping. You've probably heard the phrase slip and score before in relation to ceramics because it refers to one of the foundational processes that people use to work with clay. Clay is an amazingly versatile material in that it can be worked both in a reductive manner, like carving, similar to stone or wood, or it can also be worked in an additive manner, as in a coil pot, where you're adding additional pieces of clay onto the base. But in order to make use of that additive process that clay is so prized for, we need to be able to understand how we can attach two pieces of clay together so that they won't crack or come apart later. Water-based clay is notorious for shrinking as it dries. The water leaves the mineral substrate of the clay, and those particles contract a little bit as that moisture leaves. And so as that shrinking occurs, that puts stress on the piece of artwork that you're making. And so any inconsistencies in the drying or inconsistencies in the way that the clay is layered together are going to cause weak spots where that shrinking could cause a crack. That process continues in the kiln and the firing process. The temperature stresses on the material are going to cause any weaknesses to reveal themselves. And so we need to be able to put two pieces of clay together in such a way that they won't come apart again, even under all of that stress. Now, that's relatively simple if you're talking about a raw piece of clay fresh out of the bag from a manufacturer. If you have two pieces of wet clay that are the similar consistency, you can push those two pieces of clay back together, and even though there's a seam there, if you were to work that surface carefully, just closing that seam up with your fingers, there's a reasonable chance that these two pieces of clay will be bonded sufficiently to survive this drying and firing process. It's always best if the two pieces of clay that you're joining are the same moisture content. Now, this is different for different clay recipes and clay bodies, and so certain clays are going to be more prone to shrinkage and cracking than others. So if you're working with, say, a porcelain or a really fine-toothed clay, then some of that shrinking might be more dramatic, and a simple squish of the two pieces back together might not suffice. You can see that that piece that I originally joined didn't fully seal. So it's close, but it's not quite sufficient to withstand the drying process. So what we need to do is score and slip. There's many different ways of scoring and slipping. Some people use needle tools, but definitely a more efficient way is to use one of these scoring tools. The phrase scoring just refers to the process of scratching or etching into the surface of the clay to break the smooth surface up into finer tooth detail, and that provides more surface area for additional clay pieces to grab onto. So I'm going to separate these two pieces and say I'd like to join them again along these flat faces. I am first going to score them and rough up that surface. And I'm going to do that to both parts along the entire surface that I'd like to join. So I'm not just scoring in the center, I'm scoring all the way across that surface. And now, when I push them back together, I'm going to push firmly, and I'm going to work from one end of the seam to the other. And you can see that this clay is still quite soft. It's moving really nicely and easily through my fingers, so it's stretching and expanding at the same time as I'm rejoining those pieces. And you can see that this end is not really wanting to join, so I'm going to score a little deeper. There's really not a way to score too deeply. So if you want to use a more aggressive tool, some people even use a fork, although I find that the tines of a fork tend to be too far apart. They're spaced wider than this scoring tool, and so they don't actually rough up the surface quite as well. But if you can find a fork that's the right size, or if you want to make a scoring tool of your own, this one is just a piece of wood with a healthy dose of PC7 epoxy and some finishing nails. So you could make your own tool for scoring. but we're going to really rough up the surface aggressively. There's not really a chance of you scoring too deeply. And that increased surface area, you can see, is going to help the two parts of the clay bond together. So if that were my piece, now when I pull them apart, if it breaks along the seam, I know that my joining was bad. But you can see here's the seam over here, and it broke to the left of that seam. So that tells me that my seam was at least as strong as the rest of the piece of clay. So that's what we're looking for. Okay, so the wet clay is relatively easy to join back together. However, as the clay dries and becomes more stiff, the scoring and slipping process becomes even more crucial because the clay is less willing to bond to other pieces on its own. So we have to really coax that through the scoring and slipping process. Okay, so I'm going to switch to my smaller scoring tool, but it's the same idea. I'm going to work all the way along that surface. This piece is leather hard consistency, meaning it's not flexible anymore, at least not much. It will move a little bit, but if I force it more than that, it's going to crack. So it's not flexible, but it's still a dark color, and it still feels wet to the touch. So you can carve into it nicely, and you can handle it pretty roughly, and it's not going to break. But it's not starting to change color yet. That would be a sign of it drying a little bit past leather hard when it starts to change color. So I'm dipping my clay, or I'm dipping my scoring tool into my water bucket here, and just using that little dab of water on the tool to wet the surface that I'm scoring. So in this way, I'm kind of making slip on the surface that I'm going to join. And that's a nice way to do it because it's clean and you only make the slip right where you want it. And some of that moisture that I'm adding is actually seeping farther into the clay. So it's kind of rehydrating that seam right where it's going to join. So that might help things mesh together a little bit. And you can see why a scoring tool with 5 prongs like this one is so much more efficient than a needle tool. If you see somebody scoring with a needle tool, save them from themselves and tell them to get a scoring tool. Okay, because you can just see with a needle tool, you know, I'm going to be spending 5 times longer to make the same number of marks. And even just comparing those two, you can see the needle tool is not roughing the surface in the same way that the scoring tool is. It's making these regular indentations, but it's not forming this paste slip surface. So I'm going to switch back to my good scoring tool and keep going here. All right, and just as an example, the large scoring tool, this will work, but you can see it's kind of oversized for the amount of clay I have to work with here. And it is also, too, it's prone to making these individual cuts in the clay rather than making actually a scored surface. So I actually go back and forth when I'm using a tool. So I'll do it in one direction, kind of diagonal, and then I'll go back across that same section at a 90-degree angle, kind of like making X's down the surface of that. But really for this size of piece, this smaller scoring tool is really the proper tool. Now, you need to be judicious about adding water to a leather hard piece of clay, because if you add too much water, you're just going to weaken that surface and it's going to turn into a mush that's not going to join properly. Remember, the evaporation of water is really what's causing the shrinkage, which causes the cracking. So if you're adding a bunch more water, you are kind of reversing the shrinkage temporarily, but you're also kind of setting yourself up for trouble later. So this is what a good slip and scored surface should look like. It should be mashed up thoroughly. It should be relatively deep scoring lines, and there should be enough of a soft slip on the surface that when I squish it together, there's a slight bead of it that squirts out from the seam. Okay, and then the same thing goes. I'm going to work the seam like a zipper from one side to the other, pushing firmly the two pieces of clay together. And you can see that bead forming. As the slip squirts out of that crack. So that's really good. You can see that those parts are meshing together. Okay. And now the clay around this being almost leather hard is definitely drier than the seam I just created. So I don't want to test it right away because I know it's still going to break along this line because that's still the seam of softer wet clay. So I don't trust it to do my stress test right away. I'm going to let that set aside and stiffen maybe an hour or so. I could take that time to clean up the seam if I want it smoother. I could clean up that bead. Sometimes people like to leave the bead on certain parts of their forms to accentuate and kind of show off that it was two parts that they had put together. But certainly in building a coil pot, you will want at least one side of your pot, either the inside or the outside, to be relatively seamless because that smoother surface is going to be a little bit stronger and help you with going higher and building larger forms. So something like that, and I would let that set aside. Say you wanted to give two bone dry or stiff leather hard pieces of clay that you're trying to join back together, then you might need to add a little excess slip. So what is slip? It's just clay with extra water. So I'm going to make some right now. I'm going to take a little wad of clay and I'm going to add a little bit of water. And remember, the more water you add, the more shrinkage you're going to have to deal with later. So you don't need to make it a thin paste. You really want it more like, I don't know, like a thick yogurt consistency, like a Greek yogurt, or even thicker than that maybe. Almost like a peanut butter texture. I love the food metaphors. Okay, so you're just going to mash that up. Now, if you have dry clay, that also works fine. You can just add dry clay to water and mix that up. And some people will actually add a little bit of white vinegar into their slip. And that helps because the vinegar changes the orientation of some of the clay particles on a molecular level. And it can make it so that those particles mesh together more efficiently. So a little splash of vinegar doesn't hurt. Some people will go even farther and mix in other additives to their slip if they find themselves needing to join two pieces that are truly bone dry. We already saw that the wetter the clay is, the easier it is to join. So we want to, try to address all of the joining and additive needs of our piece earlier in the process. But, sometimes a crack forms in the drying process or maybe you drop something or knock a handle off of something and you find yourself needing to add something back onto a bone dry piece. If that's the case, then you'll definitely want to use some slip. You probably want some vinegar, and you'll want a bit of patience as well because it might not take in the first try. Okay, so you're just going to mash up that clay with some water and some vinegar until it forms a consistent kind of paste. Now we're going to show you how to attach two pieces of clay when they're more stiff, close to a bone dry. So we've got our slip mixed up here. It's nice to put that in a small container that has a lid so that you can reuse it and doesn't dry out. And then we've got our scoring tools here. And now we just need a piece of clay that's in a difficult stage to reattach. So this is the pot that I was working on yesterday. And you can see that it's now changing color. So it is close to the bone dry stage. It's not quite to bone dry yet because we can see some darker areas on the back side. And we also can feel that it's cool to the touch. And that feeling of the cool to the touch is really the signal of when something still has moisture on the inside. So this is not something I would ever advise doing. I would much rather be working on this piece when it was still in the darker leather hard stage. But if you find yourself in an emergency situation trying to repair something that broke, it can still be done. You can still add on to this piece. So I'm going to do that. Make a little bit of a handle here and just pretend that I'm going to put this handle back onto this pot. Okay, so I'll just pinch this little handle. It's nothing special. I'm doing that so you can see that this clay that I'm going to join is quite soft. However, the clay of the pot itself is quite stiff. So here I've formed the handle, but I'm going to try to let this stiffen up for a few minutes before I try to actually attach it. And as that's stiffening up, I'd like to rehydrate the two attachment points just a little bit. So I'm going to just take some water and my small sponge here. And remember, we don't want to add a lot of water now that it's in this leather hard to bone dry stage, because we're going to cause that section to re-expand, which is going to re-stress it, and then it's going to shrink again as that moisture leaves. So we don't want to overdo it, but we just want to lightly rehydrate that to try to bring these two pieces closer to the same moisture content before we actually join them. I don't want the body of this pot to dry out anymore, so that's where the spray bottle can come in handy. And again, just like the attachment points, you don't want to overdo the spraying. Just give it a light mist in a couple of the angles. Just not enough to like bring it back to a leather hard stage. You're not really trying to reverse the drying process. You just want to maintain it where it is. So give it a spritz. And then wrap up the body of the pot, leaving the handle exposed so that it can stiffen up while the body of the pot stays where it's at. Okay, so the water we've added to the pot has soaked in, and you can see there's no visible water on the surface anymore. And it is slightly a darker color, so maybe that's a good sign that this isn't totally bone dry yet. Our handle is still quite flexible, so that's great. When I said to let the handle stiffen up, I definitely don't mean to let it stiffen all the way to the point of this hard leather hard, because then you're just going to have even more trouble combining these two. So it's okay for this attachment to be a lot softer than the body of the pot, but you do want it to be stiff enough that you can handle it firmly and really force it into those scoring marks. So, if the pot's too dry, don't try to match that with the attachment. Okay, so we're going to take our scoring tool, and we're going to take our slip that we made with the vinegar. We're going to get these pieces of slip with a little bit of body to them, not just the watery parts. We're going to just score as if we were scoring normally, but we're going to really push deeply into the surface of the clay as much as we can, and we're going to have to do several passes on each point, adding more of that slip each time. And again, you can't score too deeply. You don't need to worry about breaking off chunks like that. That's a shame, but I'd rather have the piece all together the way I wanted than to go through all this work and have it still break off again in the future. So I can fix those little pieces that break off if I'm scoring too deeply. I can always add just a little bit more of this new clay to patch that up. But if I can't get the handle to stick on, then it's really, the whole piece might be ruined. So I'm going to score deeply and add some slip, and then I'm going to work the other side the same way. And I'll try to support this side better so that hopefully I don't break off pieces. Maybe you can't see that though, but something like that. If you're really working on something that's really dry like this, you might have to give it a minute for this extra moisture in the slip to soak in even more and rehydrate that the attachment point even a little bit more. So that's not a bad idea. Just be a little patient, but really score deeply in that surface. I think people often are afraid to, damage this pot. They've taken all this time to refine the surface and make it all smooth, and they don't want to scratch into the surface. But if you don't score deeply enough, then what's the point? Okay, and so while that sets up, I can score the softer handle, and I don't need to add much slip to this because this is still wet clay. So I can use the waterier, the more liquid part of the slip on this, and I don't need a whole lot. There is a point where you can add so much slip that the slip kind of fills up all of the scoring marks that you're making, and so they don't actually mesh together with the two pieces. You just have slip squishing against slip, and it doesn't really bond very well. So you're just trying to get enough slip on that surface that it becomes a tacky, sticky surface. And you can tell that on this wet clay, the slip isn't soaking in nearly as fast as it is over here. I don't know if you can see that, but I can see that. Okay, so we've got slip and deep scoring on both surfaces, and I even might have a little too much slip on this one because I feel like that might be blocking some of the scoring marks. So I might just go a little bit lighter there. And now we're going to attach. So it's the same thing. You're just going to support the parts where you're pressing against, and I'm going to push that softer new clay into the firmer, drier clay. And I'm really going to support with this hand so that I don't break off that whole rim. That's the other danger of doing your attachments at this late stage, is that it's really easy to just crack a whole piece apart, pushing on a bone dry piece. Okay, and you can see I've got a thick bead of slip here coming off. Like it's really squirting out the side, so I definitely don't need any more slip than that. This is one of those situations where more isn't necessarily better. Okay, and then I can kind of take my time to work the soft clay, make sure it's in the position I want, and didn't distort it when I was attaching it. Okay, then I'll come over to the other side and do the same thing. And you can still think about this like a zipper, working from one side of the joint to the other. Sometimes you have to get down low and change your body position to reach. And I'm working the inside. I'm pushing the inside seam just as much as the outside of the pot there. And now, in that thick bead of slip we have there, that might even be enough to squeeze this attachment or this little crumb back into place. Not sure if it'll really go or not. Actually, I don't even know which orientation it was. Something like that. That might just work. Okay. So once you've got it firmly attached like that, you can quickly wipe up that surface, but don't try to work it too hard. Don't try to stress this joint at all until it has set up. And I would recommend the slower that you can dry this joint, the more time that those two parts will have to equalize the moisture. So you want to wrap this up really tightly, maybe spritz down the body of the pot one more time to try to keep that moist. And then you're going to wrap this up really tightly. Some people will even take strips of plastic and specifically just wrap around the joints. So if you double wrap those joints, And then go ahead and wrap that whole piece. Let that sit for several days, and hopefully when you unwrap it, you'll see a nice bonded seam with no cracks.